Hello, and welcome to Top Cybersecurity Threats of 2021, a webinar by LMG Security. Our presenter for our webinar today is Sherry Davidoff. Sherry Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security and author of the recently released book, Data Breaches. As an expert in cybersecurity and data breach response, Sherry has been called a, quote, security badass by the New York Times. Her professional experiences are featured in the book Breaking and Entering, the extraordinary story of a hacker called Alien. Sherry is a GIAC certified forensic examiner and penetration tester, receiving her degree in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Also, keep your eyes peeled for her new book on ransomware, which is going to be available at the end of this year. That's very exciting. And at this time, Sherry, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I really appreciate it. Well, certainly supply chain attacks have been in the news recently. So that is our #1 top threat that we're going to talk about today. We will dig into depth in the SolarWinds hack and then related fallout from that. We'll then go into sophisticated authentication attacks that have quietly becoming a trend over the past year. And finally, we'll end with exposure extortion. And this relates both to ransomware cases and also non-ransomware related data exposure. Also, I wanted to just mention real quick, we have a cyber first responder class coming up. This is a one-day intensive class that will show you how to respond to cybersecurity incidents, how to recognize them, how to preserve evidence. We have 3 hands-on labs. We're going to show you how to respond both to on-premise incidents and in the cloud. We've got a lot of new material, so if you're interested, check it out, sign up. The URL is lmgsecurity.com/CFR. Hope to see some of you there. All right, so let's dig into supply chain attacks. Supply chain attacks are where hackers will infiltrate suppliers, in particular technology suppliers, and then leverage the access to gain either to steal information or gain access to customer network. And the result of this can be data breaches, it can be a ransomware attack, it could be espionage or other issues. So what's triggering this, of course, is the news about SolarWinds. In December, on December 13th, FireEye announced a supply chain hack. They had recognized that the SolarWinds Orion network monitoring software had a backdoor in it that would allow criminals to come into customer networks and really take over. It was a remote access, an unauthorized remote access vulnerability. And this is particularly scary because SolarWinds has many thousands of customers. And in fact, technology providers, managed service providers, and many other technology organizations are leveraging this software. So the potential ripple effects are huge. Now, some of the biggest concerns are that SolarWinds themselves did not detect this. In fact, of the 18,000 customers that we know downloaded the infected code, only one, FireEye, proactively detected this and announced it. So right away, we have some concerns that, okay, if SolarWinds is hacked, what other suppliers might be hacked in the same way that we don't yet know about? That's my #1 question here right now. But the malware that was loaded onto the system, onto customer systems, is now called SUNBURST, and it allows for a backdoor into customer networks. That means it can allow attackers to gather system information, conduct reconnaissance, transfer files, so either load files onto your system or steal files from your system, execute software, install new applications. They can reboot your local systems if they need to, disable services. We often see that when it comes to disabling antivirus software or other security software. So very sophisticated, very capable malware that got installed in the Orion software and was then distributed out to 18,000 customer networks without anybody realizing for months and months and months. Now, many of you are probably thinking that's what we get for relying on these big suppliers. I do want to point out, though, that there are also security benefits of the technology supply chain. And one example of that is relevant in this case is Microsoft's Digital Defense Report. So Microsoft came out in September with the Digital Defense Report. They draw on over 8 trillion security event logs per day. And they can also conduct proactive alerts. So they've alerted over 13,000 customers to nation state attacks. over recently. So in some cases, we can really gain access to advanced and sophisticated capabilities by relying on these centralized suppliers. So it's a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. On the one hand, we have risk because if one of these major suppliers gets hacked, then potentially we all get hacked. But on the other hand, these technology suppliers like Microsoft are aggregating information and can potentially use that to detect large-scale attacks or provide advanced intelligence and notification capabilities. So to the extent that we can start working with suppliers to leverage the benefits more, we should be doing that. However, there are, of course, dangers to supply chain threats. So when attackers are able to worm their way into a supplier, they could steal intellectual property, of course. They could modify the software, as we saw in the SolarWinds Orion case, and they can do vulnerability discovery for new attacks. So we know for a fact that Microsoft is one of the companies that was hit in the SolarWinds attack. They were using SolarWinds software. They came out and they made a statement and said, we found one unauthorized intruder that gained access to our source code. So the criminals are after source code. This was reported in the Wall Street Journal. I had a good conversation with Bob McMillan, the author, about it. And Microsoft played it off as, oh, it's no big deal. We assume that criminals will get access to our source code. And while that's probably a worthwhile assumption, there's no doubt that when criminals have access to source code, it gives them a leg up because they can go through it with a fine-tooth comb and look for bugs that they could potentially exploit later. So even if they can't modify the code, as Microsoft said, the account in question couldn't modify the code, they can still gain an advantage by having access to that source code. And it also makes you wonder, what else do they have access to, right? Okay, so here's Microsoft quote. We detected unusual activity with a small number of internal accounts, and upon review, we discovered one account had been used to view source code in a number of source code repositories. So this is not even close to the first time that we have seen a major technology supplier hacked. And in fact, it's very likely that this has quietly been going on in the background for well over a decade. And every now and then the tip of the iceberg kind of comes up above the surface and then goes back down. So this is one of those times where we're seeing the iceberg. But if you remember, back in 2009 and 2010, there was a huge news burst about Operation Aurora, where sophisticated attackers went after US corporations and technology giants, and not just Department of Defense contractors or government agencies. So at the time, we found out that Google was hacked, Adobe was hacked, Intel was hacked, Juniper, Rackspace, Yahoo, Symantec, and more. And then those stories quietly fizzled and disappeared, but the attackers did not go away. And specifically, we found out at the time that they were after source code. This was also when we started to hear the term sophisticated being used in the context of data breaches and hackers. So here, the Google hack was ultra sophisticated. Turned out it was a phishing email. Adobe said that they were investigating a corporate network security issue involving a sophisticated coordinated attack. The sophisticated hack hit Intel in January, and this is a very popular image repair tactic because the idea is to illustrate that it's not that these technology vendors were negligent. No, it's that the attackers were ultra sophisticated. And, you know, probably the truth is in the middle somewhere, let's face it. Now, at the time, McAfee published a very important and I would say landmark report that didn't get enough press about the weaknesses in source code management software. They found that the majority of Fortune 1000 companies were using the exact same source code management software called Perforce. So now we have more of a supply chain issue. We're talking about fourth-party suppliers, fifth-party suppliers. That source code management software was riddled with vulnerabilities. In the report, they showed there were unencrypted passwords. You could easily execute authentication bypass issues. So once an attacker got into a vendor's network, they could just gain access to the source code, modify the source code. It was kind of game over. And because this weak source code management software with all these weaknesses was used in so many companies, it introduced vulnerabilities throughout the system. So it's important to recognize this was an issue in 2010 that has not really been systematically addressed. You're not really seeing any laws or regulations about software security, very weak notification laws, some contractual regulations, but by and large, the source code issues that we saw in 2010 have not yet been addressed today. So you should expect that SolarWinds is the tip of the iceberg, and we may or may not find out the full scope of the problem, but there are likely other technology vendors that have been similarly hacked. Again, we have a lack of information about supply chain risks. So there aren't really any notification laws. We don't know the true risk of backdoor technology, but every now and then some stories pop to the surface that help us to understand there's more going on than we may realize. For example, in 2017, it came out that Microsoft had hackers attack and successfully gain access to their bug tracking database in 2013, 4 years previously, but they had not provided any notification about it, nor were they likely required to notify anyone. Also last year, there was the Ghosts in the Cloud report by the Wall Street Journal, and that detailed how many, over 70 different technology vendors and managed service providers were hacked, including Hewlett-Packard, IBM, Fujitsu, and many others. And because of those hacks, the criminals then wormed their way into customers. So they attacked Sabre Systems, they attacked American Airlines successfully because they were able to worm their way into suppliers. And then those stories quietly went away as well. So you can see, again, there's a trend, these things are happening, but we're not really, we're not requiring reporting all the time, and we're not seeing the full picture. Speaking of seeing the full picture, let's dig into how the SolarWinds attack happened, and then talk about what you can do to respond and protect yourself, because there are simple things you can do to protect your organization, both from a policy perspective as well as a technical perspective. So on September 4th of 2019, well over a year ago, that's when attackers started attacking SolarWinds, and they first got into the systems. They began by injecting test code, little routines in the product that didn't actually do anything. There's speculation that they just wanted to confirm that if they injected some source code, that it would then be distributed out to SolarWinds customers, and they found that in fact it was. So November 4th, they stopped injecting the test code. And then we see on February 20th, the malicious backdoor was compiled within the systems. And in March, it was distributed to customers. So between March and early June, the infected version of the Orion software was rolled out to customers. And in a minute, we'll talk about the very sneaky way that the attackers were able to inject their software in it, because it represented a new level of attack. And then in May, the criminals started actual hands-on keyboard attacks of SolarWinds customers. So that's the estimated time that they were coming into customer networks using those backdoors and actively engaging in network reconnaissance, information theft, and other activities. In June, they removed the malware from the SolarWinds environment. And again, this shows the level of sophistication, probably quite a bit of funding as well. Throughout the process, they deliberately cleaned up after self. So it wasn't a smash and grab. This was a case where they appear to be well funded, they're paying attention to the details, and they're working hard to remain undetected. And finally, on December 12th, FireEye, which of course is a very capable security company, detected the malware in their environments. Or, well, really, they detected the unauthorized access. So who is behind these sophisticated, coordinated attacks? Well, there's been a lot of speculation that it's Russia. According to the US government, it is Russian state hackers. However, Russia does deny that officially. I would imagine in either case, they would deny that. As always, I would take this with a grain of salt. We are still pretty early on in the investigative process. And again, one of the very common image repair tactics is to blame a nation state because it makes the technology companies seem like they were doing a normal level of diligence if it's nation state attackers that were breaking in. So stay tuned. It may or may not have been Russia. That's some early intelligence that we've gotten. Again, take it with a grain of salt. There is certainly evidence that these were well funded. They could also have been consultants for a nation state government. So the hacking supply chain is pretty complex and sophisticated these days. All right, so let's talk about how the attackers actually modified the SolarWinds code, because this is, again, a new level of sophistication. So first of all, they had access to the SolarWinds environment, so they're inside a supplier, and the supplier doesn't notice them for months and months. And then they actually got access to the software build server. And once they were on that server where the code actually gets compiled, so it has the source, it compiles it, and it produces the final product, they wanted to remain undetected while also injecting their code into that software that was getting rolled out to thousands and thousands of customers. So they created the SunSpot malware. And the purpose of this was to replace source code on the fly. So this is really important. They didn't modify the primary source code repository. The coders don't realize that anything's happened. Their code makes it all the way to the final build server without any modifications. And then the criminal's malware, SunSpot, will check to see if there's a recognized version of the code on there. If so, it will replace that code with their code that has the malware in it, and their code is what actually gets compiled. So they're literally replacing source code on the fly in that final phase. And you have to make sure that the suppliers are checking those final executables and making sure that they match what should be produced. So this is a question of how are you securing your software development lifecycle? And are you really checking it from beginning to end? At what points could attackers inject something? So again, very sophisticated. They're not modifying the actual source code repository anymore. They're getting it right at that phase where it's getting compiled. The criminals also took extra steps in order to prevent detection. So they would cryptographically verify this version of the source code that they were replacing, because if there were any changes, they didn't want to risk introducing errors. I'm sure they felt that if they introduced errors, that the developers might dig into it and detect them, and they didn't want that to happen. So they're verifying using cryptography. They're verifying the version of the source code that they're actually replacing. They disabled warnings during compilation. They actually kept logs. So they were creating an encrypted log file, which they named vmware.vmdump.log. So something that would really blend, and they weren't saying like hackerlogfile.log. No, VMware vmdump.log. Very smart. And then what ended up happening is that the final software product that was rolled out to customers as an update was properly and cryptographically signed by SolarWinds. So you would expect, if you're getting a valid digital signature from a supplier and that checks out, that everything's good and you can install that. Unfortunately, because the code was injected prior to the final compilation and they were leveraging the SolarWinds tools, they were also able to ensure that the infected version was legitimately signed. And as a result, 18,000 customers downloaded this infected version. Again, the dangers of supply chain hacks. So SUNBURST and the criminals behind it were very evasive. I wanted to go through some of the ways that they had built in the ability to evade detection. So first of all, the SUNBURST malware, that backdoor, once it was on a customer network, it would check for any forensics tools, antivirus tools, and disable them, or it would just stop running if there were indications that it was in a laboratory environment. Again, they're trying to evade detection. It would disable event logging. It would engage in time stomping. That's when it goes through and changes timestamps randomly throughout the file system. So that's just evil. It makes it harder for forensic investigators to piece together what happened and to build a real timeline of the attack. They also would add firewall rules at certain points to filter outgoing packets, and then they would clean up those firewall rules when they didn't need them anymore. And then when they did reconnaissance on a network, they would store those results in things that looked like configuration files. So again, files that people aren't likely to open, or if they do open it, they're not likely to understand exactly what's going on. So just another way that they're sneaky. They're not creating new files, they're just adding to configuration files that most of the time people aren't really looking at. When they were communicating on the network, they tended to blend. So you'll see throughout this, either they're going to use the Orion Improvement Protocol, a protocol that's already used by the Orion software, or in some cases we saw web traffic going across, but they're trying to blend with normal network activity. And they also made sure to install custom software on each system they were infecting, and that way they could evade signature-based detection. So very, very evil. Okay, so what did the attackers do next on customer networks? Well, they worked to establish persistence. They have this backdoor using the Orion software, and then in some cases they would install a dropper. One of those was Teardrop. This is a memory-only dropper that's used to install additional malware on the system. It does not reside on the disk. It is loaded only into memory. Again, a really effective way to evade detection. Raindrop was another type of memory-only malware that got installed. And then finally, they delivered Cobalt Strike. Now, as you may know from our November webinar, Cobalt Strike is legitimate penetration testing software, but it's so good that criminals like it too. And unfortunately, there are now variants of Cobalt Strike out there because the source code was leaked in November. So it was publicly leaked on the dark web, and now we're likely to see these issues snowballing. In fact, I think it's really interesting that here's another supply chain security issue. So the source code of Cobalt Strike is either reverse engineered or just stolen, and now it's leaked on the dark web. And as a result, we're going to see more attacks, including supply chain attacks because of that. So an issue with the cybersecurity supply chain is causing ripple effects and introducing additional risks throughout the system. So again, Cobalt Strike is being used to help the attackers expand laterally throughout the network and maintain persistence. The next thing that the criminals do once they have access to a customer network is they want to gain administrative access. And they've been doing that in one of two ways. Number one, they steal passwords. So that shouldn't surprise anybody. This has been a common tactic for 20 years or more. But the next thing, the other thing that they were seen doing was minting SAML tokens. So they stole the SAML token signing certificate, and that allowed them to forge SAML tokens and essentially masquerade as any user they wanted on the network. And we're starting to see this more and more, where the criminals are going after private keys. They're going after certificates that are used to sign things. And in that manner, they can gain a whole new level of administrative access. It's not just taking over one account. It's literally taking over the network. And this is why if you do get hacked, it's actually important to change things like your private keys and not just kind of wave it away, because the attackers could still have access long term. There have also been forensic analysts that say the criminals are using common tools. So again, not things that would trip antivirus signatures, but common tools that IT staff might use to manage a network. The criminals are using as well. They're attacking on-premise environments, they're attacking cloud environments, they're jumping between the two, but their primary goal is to establish persistence long-term. And in fact, in a lot of cases, they're removing that original backdoor or some of their original tools as they progress, as the attack progresses in order to evade detection. They're also conducting data mining, as you might expect. So they're exploring user emails. They're specifically targeting key IT staff, security personnel. They're stealing files. They're doing things like mimicking legitimate applications. Microsoft cautioned that if you're responding or you think that you might have been impacted by SolarWinds, you should assume that your communications are accessible to the actor. And what that means is that they are seeing the malicious actor monitoring emails as the response is underway. So keep that in mind. Think about how you might communicate out of band in cases where you may have an adversary on your network. And this isn't just for nation state actors. I mean, this is becoming par for the course in ransomware cases we see and other cases. We've certainly seen ransomware actors quite recently say, "How was your Zoom call?" And actually, this other company was wrong when they investigated. We saw that happen recently as well. So the criminals may well be monitoring your communications if you have an issue. All right, so another thing that was announced, it's hard to keep track of all the different types of malicious software and ways that criminals had access to the SolarWinds network, because it turns out that there was another sneaky backdoor installed on customer systems, and that is called SUPERNOVA. It was likely planted by a different attacker group that had access in March of 2020, and it allows for arbitrary remote code execution. This is a really interesting piece of software. It actually allows for remote code to reside in memory only. So it looks like a program. It's an infected .NET library module that can come with the SolarWinds package. And it looks like it's just producing a copy of the logo upon request. There's a lot of cases where other parts of the software might need the logo. So it takes a request, it produces the logo. However, if there are four very specific parameters set via HTTP, then it will provide more than just the logo. In fact, the software will then execute any arbitrary code that the attacker feeds it. It will read it into memory, it will execute it, and that's it. So that allows criminals, again, a remote backdoor into customer systems. You're not going to find traces of whatever was executed on the disk because it's just loaded directly into memory. However, if you review the logs, if you're curious if this has happened to you, you can review the logs and find those HTTP requests with 4 specific parameters. And that's how you know that there was at least an attempt to activate this malware. So again, it's a little frightening that this is likely related to a wholly different attacker group. So what's next? Well, we should expect to see more fallout from the SolarWinds attack over time, particularly because so many organizations are still investigating. All of us should be investigating, doing your due diligence, and we'll talk in a moment about how to do that. But in general, there's a lack of detection capabilities. It's very hard to detect attacks like this. SolarWinds themselves didn't detect it. Almost 18,000 other customers did not detect it either. And there's also gaps in notification requirements. So if a supplier like this gets hacked, when do they have to notify you, and do they have to notify you at all? We've also seen, again, major providers who have been impacted by the SolarWinds hack. Deloitte and Touche is one of them. So they came out and said, yes, we were running SolarWinds and everything's fine. And there's this cute article about it. This is fine, don't worry about it. But then the question is, what other providers are we going to see making similar statements over the next year or 2 years or more? So that's a quick run through of the SolarWinds attack. If there are any questions, please feel free to shout it out. I also I think I may have skipped a slide. I wanted to mention how many customers were affected. We saw tech giants like Intel, Cisco, VMware, Microsoft, Belkin, again, professional services firms, security firms, obviously many branches of the government were impacted, universities, hospitals. Here's a chart that was produced by Microsoft that shows 44% of the organizations impacted were information technology companies. And I think that's really telling, because it means that once hackers get into an information technology company, they can potentially use that to gain access to really our entire technology supply chain. How many of you use Adobe products? Yep, pretty much all of us. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to shout it out, and let's talk about how we respond to this. One sec, let me just jump ahead. Okay, so how should you respond to the SolarWinds hack? First of all, we have to check our own networks, and it's a good idea just to write something up so that you know you've done your due diligence. We have an advisory as well in the handouts panel of this talk, so you can go through and take a peek at that. But ask, was the SolarWinds malware installed on your network? First of all, do you use SolarWinds software at all? And if you do, check to see if you used one of the versions that has been affected. If that's the case, make sure you are conducting threat hunting. Even if that original backdoor was removed, the criminals may still have installed malware on your network. So it's a very smart idea these days to do proactive threat hunting, something LMG has been doing quite a bit for some of our customers recently. And then respond appropriately. CISA and DHS and the CERT teamed up. They produced Emergency Directive 2101. I put a link on the screen for you guys, so take a look at that. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to drop me a line on LinkedIn and I can provide more guidance. Also, there's a new tool out, a new free tool for hardening Microsoft 365. FireEye just released it a week or two ago. It's called the Azure AD Investigator, and it will automatically go through your environment and audit your systems and look for any signs of the SolarWinds attack and indicators. So check that out. It just came out on January 19th. Again, I've provided a link for you guys here. It's the Azure AD Investigator. And then finally, perhaps the hardest part, we need to check our supply chains. So do you have any third-party suppliers that you rely upon which have been infected by the SolarWinds malware? Now, you may or may not be able to check all of your suppliers. What's most important is that you prioritize. Think about cloud providers, hardware and software vendors, managed service providers in particular, anyone that has privileged access to your network environment that can change configuration, you're going to want to check on. Security firms like FireEye or other critical vendors, professional services firms that may hold on to your data. So think about who has access to your data directly, and then who has privileged access to your network, or whose software do you use? And you can ask them some specific questions. Again, we gave you some examples in the one sheet that I've provided as a handout, but ask them to confirm in writing if they have used an affected version of SolarWinds Orion, and ask if they're actively assessing the risk due to their supply chain, because we are seeing criminals engaging in these multi-stage attacks where they get access to one supplier and they use that to get access to their customers, and then they may even use that access to get access to customers. So we have to worry about fourth-party risks and fifth-party risks. Make sure you're giving your suppliers a deadline for responding, and don't assume that a supplier will proactively contact you if there's a problem. If you do not hear from a supplier, assume it's bad news and act accordingly. All right, so speaking of suppliers, there are other supply chain issues besides SolarWinds. So here's one example from last week where a ransomware installation occurred because of an infected supplier. IOBit forums was hacked. They were used to send phishing emails to their community, and also their website was used to serve up malware that would then lead to ransomware. So unfortunately, people who clicked on the link in that phishing email and downloaded the code were impacted with ransomware. You can see the ransom note on the screen right here. We also saw last year, again, this is a trend, managed service providers were used to infect customers. There were 22 towns in Texas that were hit. The Techniqu gang was deliberately targeting managed service providers because, hey, why infect just one organization if you could infect like 100, right? And again, we saw more and more managed service providers being used for criminals to leapfrog into customer networks. Now, the good news is that most MSPs have really put much stronger security measures in place over the past year, ensure that they're using two-factor authentication. You can set time limits, things like that, for when vendors can access your network. So we have certainly seen an improvement, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And then there's the cloud. Ransomware absolutely hits the cloud. That's one of our big research topics for this year at LMG. But we certainly saw in the Blackbaud case, Blackbaud was a cloud provider, is a cloud provider that serves thousands of different organizations all around the world. They help many nonprofits and even for-profit companies do fundraising. And so they hold financial information, social security numbers, and all kinds of other sensitive information about people's activities and interests. So they were hit with ransomware, and reportedly the criminals accessed data. Blackbaud stated that they actually paid to ensure that the data was deleted, and that of course raises the question of how can you trust criminals. But as a result, hundreds of organizations then had to do their own investigation to determine what data exactly were they storing on Blackbaud systems, and did they need to announce a data breach. So this caused huge ripple effects throughout the whole system. You can see millions of individuals were affected because of this. Same thing with Tyler Technologies. Many of you, I'm sure, have been impacted by this. It hit a lot of public entities, and they urged clients to reset remote network passwords after they too were hit with a ransomware attack. And as we'll talk about later in this presentation, more and more ransomware gangs are taking to stealing data and not just locking it up. So that has changed the way we need to deal with those. I received a question before this talk, and thanks to those of you who have asked questions ahead of time. What is risk management? So as we go through this presentation and we talk about how to manage your supply chain risk, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So a risk is a matched threat and vulnerability pair. So you have a threat like a hacker group, and you have a vulnerability, like let's say a vulnerability in your website, and the hacker group goes after the vulnerability. And you need to think about what is the potential impact if that happens? What is the likelihood of this happening? And then finally, how do I control this risk, or do I even want to do that? So risk management is the process of actively monitoring and controlling your risks. You can't control your risks unless you monitor them, unless you know what they are. So our options for risk treatment include avoid the risk entirely. I don't need to have a website. These days you do, probably. You can mitigate the risk, so you can make sure to stay up to date on software patches and things like that. You can accept the risk, and we all accept a certain level of risk just to go about our everyday business, so we're always accepting risks. And then finally, you can transfer your risk to a third party, and that's where we see cyber insurance coming into play, where we're transferring some of those potential financial losses to a third party, making sure that we have some help in the response. So that is what we talk about when we discuss risk management. So how can we manage the risks involved in the supply chain? Well, you need to vet your suppliers first and foremost. And I know for many of this, supply chain vetting has been on the would like to have list, but not on the it's typically not the fire of the day. So this year in 2021, make it a resolution to make your supply chain vetting program just a little bit better. It doesn't have to be perfect, but try to make some progress. Number one, as Madison Eiler on our team says, she runs our advisory team, she says, keep it simple. So the simpler you make it, the easier it will be to actually implement. Make sure you are prioritizing your suppliers. You will not be able to vet all of your suppliers, but examine your list of suppliers and think about which ones have privileged access to your network, which ones do you rely on for critical services, and then which ones have access to your confidential information. Prioritize them. Take a risk-based approach, so address the highest risk issues first. I would definitely recommend establishing a standard questionnaire for every single supplier, and ideally a form that they need to fill out so that you're receiving all your responses in the same form. Then you want to collect information, evaluate your responses, track and follow up. And that's where, again, a lot of times we see these programs kind of falling down where suppliers don't respond, and then before you know it, a whole year has gone by. So this year, try to identify your top suppliers if you haven't already. Identify the questions you need to ask, get responses, and then see what you need to do to at least make those risks a little bit less. We've also provided you with a handout on supply chain risk management, hot off the presses. So take a look at that. Let me know what you think. If you use the NIST cybersecurity framework, I know many of you do, then you can do your due diligence by following the supply chain risk management controls. So it starts with defining your risk management processes, prioritizing your suppliers, delegating requirements through contracts. That is one of the biggest challenges. Make sure that you are spelling out your cybersecurity requirements, your expectations for notification, and that you intend to be vetting them on an annual basis and they need to respond. So when you have that kind of leverage, and I know we don't always, when you have that kind of leverage, build it in. And then make sure you're monitoring your supplier risk, that you're tracking this in one central place. You've established responsibility for doing that. And then finally, this last item I think is really important. Integrate your key suppliers into response and recovery planning. So when you have a tabletop exercise, make sure it's not just your internal team. If you're hosting data in the cloud, think about how are we going to contact our cloud provider? What kind of evidence are we going to get? And involve your cloud provider in that response and recovery planning process. Okay, so some questions to ask. Will suppliers notify you if they suspect a breach? I can tell you 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. In the case of Blackbaud, they knew that there was a hack. They were hit with ransomware. They paid a ransom demand, and they did not tell customers for 2 months. And then at that point, each of the customers needed to do their own investigation and would have had to rely on Blackbaud for evidence, to the extent possible. Speaking of which, what evidence exists? What logs will the supplier give you in the event that there is an incident? And who will cover the investigation and notification costs? A lot of people think, well, if a cloud provider is hacked, it's their fault, so they're going to cover my investigation costs. Not so much of the time. Often there are big carve-outs in those contracts. You are responsible for the security of your own data, or they may simply not have the means to cover investigation for their many thousands of customers. So really think through, if our cloud provider was hacked, even if it's not your fault, who is responsible for fronting the cost of the investigation, the notification? Would your insurance cover it? Would their insurance cover it? A lot of times no insurance covers it. And then crank up your own logging and monitoring. This is the year of detection. We need to get much better about detecting incidents. So make sure that you turn on logging. This can save you an absolute fortune if you do experience an incident. It's once you think a hacker may have broken in, you want to know, where did they go? What did they have access to? And that's the point where most people say, oh, I wish we had turned on that logging. So run, don't walk after this presentation. Turn it on now. Make sure you have appropriate retention times. So in the cloud, E3 is, I think, by default 90 days. E5 you can get up to a year. Logging is often built in, but just not turned on. To the extent that you can centralize your logging, I love Splunk. It's a commercial tool where you can use Elk Stack and Kibana. That is free, or the software itself is free. And then make sure that you're effectively monitoring. It will do you very little good if you're collecting a bunch of logs that show there are issues, but nobody is looking at them regularly. For most small to mid-sized organizations, I would definitely recommend outsourcing your monitoring program, because it's just the kind of activity that you really need to scale up. You need a whole team of people that's constantly monitoring. And one way you can prevent problems cheaply and efficiently is by limiting your suppliers' access. So often suppliers have much more access than they really need, or if you're looking at a professional service provider, they want to hang on to your data for long periods of time. So think about what you actually want them to have access to and limit it to what they really need. And that in and of itself will reduce your risk. We also need to be collaborating on supply chain security. Supply chain security might seem like a really daunting problem, and it is. It's not something that one organization can fix. But right now, we need to be working together on this issue. So raise this topic, supply chain security, in your local community. If you have a meetup group, if you have a local InfoSec group, or an ISAC that you work with, now is the time for us to be pushing for better and stronger supply chain standards, for notification requirements that match our expectations and help us to reduce risk. We are likely to see legislation of some kind coming out over the next year or two relating to cybersecurity, particularly because of the impact on the federal government with the fallout of the SolarWinds attack. So Biden has already made a statement on cybersecurity priorities. They've hired some very talented security professionals to work in the new administration. I'm really excited about it. So stay tuned. Again, we're likely to see more legislation. All right, with that, again, feel free to shout out if there are any questions. And in the meantime, let's continue on and talk about sophisticated authentication attacks. This year, criminals have moved beyond password theft, which is too bad, because many of us are still trying to get a handle on the huge amount of password theft that happens. But criminals have already lapped us. They've moved on to stealing private keys and certificates, as we've alluded to. They're leveraging application consent phishing, and they're bypassing multi-factor authentication. So let's dig into how this works. First of all, just to make sure we're on the same page, authentication is how we verify someone's identity. And there are 3 ways to authenticate an entity: with something you know, like a password, something you have, like a driver's license, or something you are, like a fingerprint or some other kind of biometrics. When you use more than one type together, we call that multi-factor authentication. So in the case of SolarWinds, there have been many indications that the SolarWinds hackers are bypassing multi-factor authentication or engaging in these very sophisticated attacks. For example, in one case, they found that the SolarWinds hackers accessed a customer's network, and they were able to access the email of a user that was using multi-factor authentication. So they got access to the OWA interface, and they were reading this email, and it was looking like they were successfully authenticating using Duo, but they weren't. Turns out what happened is that the criminals gained administrative privileges to the OWA server. And at that point, it's game over. If they have access to the backend server, they can do whatever they want, including, again, implementing these very sophisticated attacks. So they stole a Duo secret key from the Outlook web app server, and they used that key to generate a valid Duo SID cookie. So when they went to log into the system, they would present the valid username and password, and then they would present the valid Duo SID cookie so that it looks like they are successfully authenticating. And in this way, they bypassed multi-factor authentication. So again, the lesson to this is that if you've been hacked, if you suffer a breach, change all of your secrets, not just passwords, Make sure you're also changing the secret keys, everything you can think of, or the criminals will still have access. Mimecast was hacked. Mimecast announced that criminals stole a private certificate that was used to secure communications between Microsoft 365 and customer networks. And that meant that criminals could successfully intercept emails and other communications and read the contents of communications. So Mimecast is, again, an email security provider. Their private certificate was compromised, and about 10% of their customers could potentially have had their email or other private communications read. Reportedly, this was the same threat actor as the SolarWinds attack. So why do attackers steal private keys? Well, they can be used to digitally sign software. That's scary when you think about it. They can be used to read encrypted communications. We saw earlier, they can be used to forge tokens. So for example, to forge tokens for Active Directory accounts, and ultimately to gain privileged access to resources. Here's another one. Malwarebytes said they were hacked. Yet another cybersecurity company that said they were hacked by the same group that breached SolarWinds. And this case was a little different. In the case of Malwarebytes, the criminals actually created a self-signed certificate. So they forged a certificate, and then they installed it so that it would be a trusted certificate. And you can see a little quote from the Malwarebytes researcher. The threat actor added a self-signed certificate with credentials to the service principal account. So again, allowing them to masquerade as an entity of their choice. Okay, let's talk about consent phishing. Consent phishing has been huge, especially as more and more people have suddenly raced to the cloud over the past year. Consent phishing is when criminals send phishing emails to victims in the hopes that the victim will grant permission to an app. And that app will then be able to read your files or access your email or engage in other privileged activity. In September, Microsoft discovered and removed 18 Azure AD apps that were sponsored by that were used by Chinese state-sponsored hackers. So these are just one example of malicious apps that are already installed in trusted systems. And on the right, you can see an example of the permissions that are requested of victims. So again, that email goes out. People are asked to click on a link and give this app permissions, and it says this app would like to read your contacts, read your mail, read and write to your mailbox settings, so potentially forward your emails, have full access to all the files you have access to, and so much of the time users will click accept, which is scary to think about. So you can prevent this from happening by limiting your users' abilities to just install random apps willy-nilly. That's one important defensive measure that you can take. This is also how the SANS Institute was hacked. I'm sure many of you in the security industry are familiar with them. SANS provides security education. They were hacked, and they, true to form, they shared details. I was pretty impressed at the level of detail that they provided the community. Here's the phishing email that was used to hack them, copy of July bonus, and when you open that, it will take you to a Microsoft login page where you are then asked to type in your password and sign in and give an app permissions. So again, they're bypassing multi-factor authentication by trying to give apps trusted privileges. And these are targeting cloud collaboration sites. So what can you do about this? Verify third-party apps, lock it down, restrict that default user access to third-party apps. It's kind of like the local admin issue of the day. You don't want people to install things willy-nilly. Make sure that you're really limiting application permissions and only giving applications the access that they need in order to do what you want them to do. And finally, let's talk about the ways that criminals are bypassing interactive multi-factor authentication. Again, this has become more and more of an issue over the past year or two. So social engineering is one big way we see this done. Criminals are literally calling up users and tricking them into reading codes over the phone. Or we've seen cases where a user will get a notification on their phone saying, you know, hey, someone's trying to log into your Microsoft account, accept or deny, and they click accept even though it wasn't them. We also see phishing sites, so they click on a link, it looks like a phishing site. Microsoft is the #1 most impersonated brand out there today, so not to pick on them, but it's very common. And it might ask for their username, their password, and a code from their phone. And again, once the user enters that code, the criminals can then steal that and feed it into Microsoft's real site so that they get access. We also see SIM jacking or SIM swapping, where criminals take over your phone. This happened to Jack Dorsey, the Twitter CEO. They'll call a telecommunications provider up, or maybe just use an app and say, hey, I got a new phone. And if they have personally identifiable information like your social security number, they're a lot more likely to succeed in that. Once your phone number is ported to their new phone, the criminals will then receive all your PINs so that they can potentially log into your bank account, your work, or other places. You can prevent this from happening by adding a PIN to your cellular account. In general, text message, SMS-based authentication is much less secure than app-based two-factor authentication. We saw NIST declare, I think it was 4 years ago in 2016, that SMS-based two-factor authentication is dead because text messages, SMS messages, are not encrypted and they can easily be intercepted. Reddit is one example of a company that was hacked, even though they had turned on multi-factor authentication for their employee accounts. But what they found was that those text messages were intercepted and SMS-based authentication was not as secure as they had hoped. That was their quote. So instead, first of all, any multi-factor authentication is better than no MFA. I would way rather see you guys using SMS-based authentication than nothing, right? But ideally, partly that's because password-based attacks are rampant. We know as of this summer that there are over 15 billion compromised credentials available for sale on hacker forums. We know that employees reuse passwords from personal accounts to work accounts, and it's very hard to stop them from doing that. And so criminals will buy those databases and just try them every place they can. At this point, I assume that if something is secured just with a password, that password will be stolen or has already been stolen and criminals are in. So any multi-factor authentication is better than no multi-factor authentication. But if you can, choose stronger multi-factor authentication. So turn off SMS-based authentication, use hardware tokens or apps. I love apps because they are cheap, but sometimes free. They're convenient. You can keep a long list of different sites just using one app. Make sure you're configuring your apps wisely so that they're authenticating using these strong measures. And then train users to resist social engineering and phishing attacks. They should know if they get a pop-up on their phone that says, hey, will you please click this to allow someone access to your account? If it's not them, they shouldn't be clicking on the link. All right, we have a few minutes left to briefly touch on our third top threat of 2021, exposure extortion. This was a huge change over the past year, and it is only going to continue. We are seeing more and more threats to expose stolen data, and criminals are using that as an extortion tactic. Pay us or we're going to publish your data online. A year ago, I advised people, do not pay these extortion attempts, because what's to stop them from coming back in 6 months and trying to get more money from you? But the problem we're seeing over the past year is that often data subjects whose information is stolen see the payment as due diligence, that it shows that your company did everything they could to prevent the hackers from publishing the data. So we're seeing, unfortunately, a lot of pressure to pay the criminals these extortion demands, even though it may or may not actually do any good. So here's a couple examples of where data exposure already has been taking center stage in January of 2021. We saw Parler, the social media platform, 70 terabytes of information was just dumped out there to the world. And so these are messages that users thought were private, for better or for worse, including GPS location information, including deleted messages. So when users deleted a message, Parler didn't actually take the time to remove that message from the system. It would just mark it as deleted. Those are out there as well. So this can potentially be very damaging for people's reputation, for their relationships, and that's just on a personal level, not to mention potential business implications. We also saw in the SolarWinds case, exposure extortion suddenly rose to the forefront as well. Just in the past week or two, criminals set up a site called solarleaks.net, and they claimed, as you can see on the screen here, that they're putting data from our recent adventure for sale. They have Microsoft Windows source code, Cisco source code, SolarWinds source code, and FireEye private red team tools source code, binaries, and documentation, all for sale. You can get all this leaked data for $1 million. Is this true? I suspect not. My gut is that these criminals are just putting this out there and hoping someone will pay them some money, but you never know. And I think we're going to see more and more of that over the next year, where we're seeing criminals threaten to expose data to the world, and we don't even know if they have that data. But so think about that carefully. If you see a news article or a website where criminals say, we have this sensitive information, remember they're criminals. Don't trust them, and think about whether or not they actually have proof that they have the data. So there's been a spike of double extortion ransomware attacks. If you are hit with ransomware, it's not just about having backups anymore. If you have backups, the criminals will still try to extort money from you in about 50% of all ransomware cases. They are stealing your information before they ever install ransomware. And that makes sense because they have access to your data in order to lock it up. Might as well grab it as well. So they're threatening to publish that. There's journalists that are following many of the websites that the Maze Group and other popular double extortion groups were putting up there. And as a result, these threats have some weight behind them. Here's one where a financial institution, a bank, was actually hacked by criminals. And instead of just locking up the data, the criminals threatened to dump millions of credit cards out there for the world. And they ended up doing that. They leaked that credit card information, causing potential PCI violations, fraud, and more. So this hits financial institutions for sure. Here's law firms. The Revo gang has been, they started copying the Maze Group, and they created the Happy blog where they started leaking stolen information to the world. You can see 2 law firms were hacked by the Revo gang, and their data was put up there for sale. And that's, again, a supply chain concern. If one of these law firms was hacked, would they notify you that your data was out there? A lot of times they don't even know about it, but once they do know about it, it can take a long time before they decide to notify clients. And sometimes if they pay the ransom and the data is never published, they choose not to notify. So make sure that you have those expectations in writing. We've seen a huge rise in targeted healthcare ransomware attacks, and Tenable did a research project. They found that 46.4% of healthcare data breaches were actually caused by ransomware attacks. So almost 50% of healthcare breaches have an underlying cause of ransomware. The criminals are getting better and better at what they do. So last year we started seeing them form stronger cartels. The Maze Group had a very popular site, again, that many journalists and others were visiting to see what their latest leaks were. And so they started allowing other cyber criminals to post their stolen data here. So here's one, Maze Cartel provided by Ragnar. And the Ragnar Locker ransomware gang started posting their data there as well. So that's scary. As a result of this, we're starting to see more and more data breach lawsuits that happen as a result of ransomware attacks. This is a trend that started last year and absolutely will continue. So Blackbaud was sued. We see some healthcare clinics getting sued as a result. So again, that's a trend that we're likely going to see. The good news is that you can prevent a lot of the damage from happening with effective detection tactics. So in this chart by FireEye, you can see the amount of time that has elapsed between the time a ransomware gang accesses your network and the time that they actually deploy ransomware. And in that time period, they are lurking and researching and stealing your data. So you want to be able to proactively find them before they have stolen your crown jewels. So make sure that you are conducting threat hunting and monitoring, budget for effective monitoring, budget for threat hunting this year, in addition to moving forward on your supply chain vetting process. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop us a line. I'm on LinkedIn. You can drop us a line through the contact form at LMG's website as well, or any other way you would like to contact us. Okay, so if you are hit with exposure extortion, do you pay the ransom or do you not? Again, one question is, how do you know if they've really deleted the data? We are starting to see cracks in the facade. We know that many of the games like Techniqu, Maze, Netwalker, and others have in some cases not held up their end of the bargain, and for one reason or another, the data gets published anyway. So you're out the money, and then you still might have to announce. But you know, there's pros and cons to this. Last year we saw Uber, the former Uber security chief, was charged with concealing a hack. Two criminals extorted Uber for $100,000. They stole data and they promised if they were paid $100,000, they would delete it. Uber did not disclose that breach. And their former CISO is now being criminally charged as a result. So watch out. That is, again, likely to be a trend. The criminals even signed an NDA, but later on, they were actually indicted as a result of another hack. And they said, yeah, we deleted it, but we also shared the data with one of our friends. And we don't know what that person did with it. So you can't trust criminals. And a lot of times this data gets laundered and put out on the dark web anyway. So again, we are seeing a new trend of payment as due diligence. It makes the data subjects feel better if you pay the ransom. It can make them angry if you don't, but then you're also funding criminal operations. So how do ransomware gangs get in? Typically 3 ways. Either they compromise your organization using exposed RDP login interfaces, they engage in email phishing, or there's a software vulnerability that they exploit. So what can we do to protect ourselves from these types of exposure extortion attacks? Number 1, use a VPN so that you don't have an exposed RDP interface. Make sure you're defending against phishing, not to sound like a broken record, but it's one of the top ways that you can prevent problems from happening. Think before you click. Patch your systems. I know cases like SolarWinds might make people hesitant to patch, but it is so important to patch your systems, and not just your workstations and servers, but also things like your VPNs. We have seen criminals over the past year really monitoring carefully for vulnerabilities in VPNs. We saw the Revel ransomware gang was specifically targeting Pulse secure VPN servers after vulnerability was announced. We've seen some other vulnerabilities announced recently. So make sure you're right on top of patching. The risk from not patching is greater than the risk involved in a supply chain issue. So patch your systems regularly. To recap, our top threats in 2021, number 1, supply chain attacks. Cannot emphasize that enough. Number 2, sophisticated authentication bypass issues. Number 3, exposure extortion. And here's our checklist of defensive measures to prioritize this year. Number 1, vet your suppliers and include those key suppliers in your response planning. Crank up your logging and monitoring. This is the year of detection. Make sure you're limiting your suppliers' access. That can reduce your risk very quickly without a big investment. Choose strong multi-factor authentication, conduct threat hunting, and patch your systems. There's a few others in there. I'll let you go through this at your leisure. Again, just try to make whatever progress you can. Aim for progress and not perfection in 2021. Again, we have another Cyber First Responder class coming up. Hope to see some of your faces there. It's 1-day boot camp, hands-on, and it'll show you how to detect and respond to cybersecurity incidents. So check it out, lmgsecurity.com/CFR. And thank you so much. I will stick around for a few minutes in case anyone has any questions.
Thanks so much, Sherry, for that presentation. We have come to the end of our time today, so if anyone has any questions that they would like to be answered, feel free to drop Sherry a line. She has her social media information up on the screen, and you are also welcome to reach out to LMG Security, and somebody will be happy to answer any questions you have. We would like to thank everyone who attended today's webinar. Please take a moment to fill out the survey afterwards and let us know what you thought. The recorded video from this presentation and handouts will be made available to attendees, and we will send out a notification once they are live. Thank you to everybody and have a great day.